Hey guys, Kaif here, bringing you another build guide. This time, I've built a Herald of Purity Guardian that primarily focuses on being tanky, while still being able to push out respectable DPS. The build takes advantage of scaling armour through the skin of the loyal body piece, and other pieces of gear that abuses the interaction of Aegis Aurora Shield, which replenishes energy shield by 2% of armour when we block. With max attack and spell block, this means we're always passively topping up our energy shield. The build also scales high amounts of energy shield by getting flat ES on gear, using Shaper's Touch, a Clarity Watcher's Eye, and in addition to taking advantage of our high mana pool, which is over 5k, we use this to further increase our energy shield through Radiant Faith and different nodes on the tree. This is further enhanced by even more defensive layers: Fortify, Molten Shell, Overcapped Resistances, Enfeeble, and Corrupted Blood Immunity. These defensive layers complement our armor ES max block setup instead of conflicting with it by scaling other forms such as dodge and evasion and wasting skill points. The end result is a build that, besides damage over time on other degens, is virtually unkillable. We can literally face tank anything, including the Sirus DPS. We have over 100k armor, roughly 9k ES, and non-stop replenishment of our ES. You might be asking, what's left to invest in DPS after investing so heavily in defensive layers? That's where Herald of Purity comes in. It gives us all our damage. We scale gem levels from our body armor, empower, and cold point dagger. Coupled with 2 Circle of Guilt iron rings, this gives us over 3 million Sirus DPS, with the potential for more through additional gem levels from chest corruption and other forms. Now, in order to fit all auras, clarity, determination, discipline, and a fully 6-linked Herald of Purity, you might run into mana issues. Now, you must ensure that you have the max roll of the mana reservation cost on both rings. You must take all the reduced mana reservation nodes from the tree as visible in my skill tree in the path of building, and you must ensure that you try to get high mana rolls on all pieces of gear. Now, if after all this you're still having trouble with mana, you can always link auras to Enlighten if necessary, or until you get the mana that you require, you can run Herald of Purity on a 5-link. It is important though that we run discipline and determination, because those are key aspects to making the build work. Now, if your DPS is low at first, that's fine, because the build is primarily a tank, and even if the fight takes 1 hour, we will never die in that 1 hour. Unless, of course, it's a fight that limits your surroundings, like something like Uber Elder, which the ground has more degen over time. Besides that, almost all bosses are killable with ease. Now, if you're already pretty versed in Path of Exile, the path of building is linked below in the description. You can open it up, check the stats, the tree, all the gear and everything, and use that to make the build yourself. You do not necessarily have to watch any more of the video. I'd appreciate it if you do, but the choice is up to you. Just bear in mind when importing POB data that it's sometimes necessary to manually link the cluster jewels that are on the tree. If not, you can continue to watch the video, and I'll go into more detail as to how and why I made certain choices, including not using Arcali's Fang because the DPS isn't consistent on bosses, and Cold Point also gives us additional defensive benefits by also boosting the level of our Molten Shell and our determination, and it also gives Carrion Golem a few more levels just because. Now let's get into the gear and skill gems. So we'll go over all the gear necessary to make this build work, beginning with Cold Point. You need 1 Cold Point dagger, right? It's not very expensive, it's around 1 Exalt, so the investment cost is not that high. I would not necessarily recommend this build be your league start. You can get something with more DPS so you can farm up the currency and go through this stuff faster. So you'd put your 3 auras in the cold point. That's determination, clarity if you're using the Watcher's Eye, and discipline. And that's it for the weapon. Now for the helmet, we're using Memory Vault Praetor Crown. Now this is necessary because it gives us the gain armor equal to your reserved mana, right? So if we have a ton of reserved mana, which we do, we wind up with a ton of armor as well. So all the uniques in this build are pretty much mandatory, and this is a very important one. And here we'd put Cyclone, Link to Fortify, Maim, and Culling Strike. And now we have the Aegis Aurora Champion Kite Shield. Pretty much the build enabler here, even though all the uniques are important, because of that 2% energy shield replenishment on block, and we're max block, so we're blocking all the time and consistently topping up our energy shield. In here we'd have the first of 2 Cast When Stunned setups, and in this one we would have Cast When Stunned linked to Flesh Offering and Desecrate, so we can constantly have Flesh Offering. Now next up for Amulet, we're using an Astromantis Onyx Amulet, which is best in slot. It gives so many flat attributes that boost us in a variety of ways, including DPS, mana, ES, armor. We get everything from this just because of the flat attributes. We will roll attribute modifiers on it to further boost it, and you can go ahead and allocate Aligned Spirits. Now Aligned Spirits gives you more mana, which in turn leads to more energy shield and more armor, and it also gives your minions a bit more DPS. If you feel there's something on the tree that is better than Aligned Spirits, or you change up the build in a variety of ways, perhaps something like Potency of Will be better, but the build as it stands, Aligned Spirits is the best node to have on your amulet. Now moving on to the rings, which are equally as important as the shield in terms of damage output. We use 2 of these Circle of Guilt iron rings, which they give flat all attributes, physical damage, armor, which we definitely need, and some of the most important stats. Herald of Purity has X amount of mana reservation. Now we definitely want this particular roll to be maximum, so either buy it maximum or divine it until you get the max roll, because both rings must have the max roll. And then we have Sentinels of Purity deal X amount of damage. Try to get as close to 100 as possible, but the primary thing we want is that reduced mana reservation. Now if you're playing on standard, and you will have a few persons playing on standard, especially with the new league coming out that is an expansion overall and not just a league, you'll have a lot more persons just deciding to continue on standard. You will have access to the legacy variants, which give more reduced mana reservation, and you're not able to divine those, or they'll just come back down to the reduced amount. So definitely get these with the maximum rolls, and we'll need 2 of these to ensure that we are able to run Herald of Purity along with our other auras, and that we have some sort of DPS for endgame. Now for our belt, we use a Stygian Vice, and the primary reason why we must use a Stygian is because it has a jewel socket. Now our jewels are primarily made up of uniques, and this is where we'll take advantage of the corrupted blood immunity role that can be applied to certain jewels, and we'll get a ghastly jewel. The stats are up to you. Mine personally has minions deal 3 to 9 additional physical damage. Minions have 8% increased attack speed if you or your minions have killed recently, and 3% movement speed if you haven't taken damage recently. Those stats are entirely up to you. You could also go for flat energy shield or flat armor, But the most important thing we want on this jewel is corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you. It makes you significantly more tanky by not having to worry about having an anti-bleed flask. As you can see in the screen, I've gotten to level 97, and since getting this gem, bleeding has not been an issue because primarily it's corrupted blood that typically messes you up. Back to the belt itself, this is where we need to get as much resistances as possible. So the stats that you need to make sure that you get is as much flat armor as possible, preferably over 400. Flat energy shield if you can. So get flat armor, flat energy shield. Unfortunately I have flat life instead, but that's fine. And get all 3 resistances. So you need the flat armor and all 3 resistances, and then you want to craft onto it the armor and energy shield. For boot slot, we use rainbow slide conjure boots, and this is where we'd slot in our second cast when stunned setup. Now we do not have enough mana to be casting high level skills, so we rely on cast when stunned setups, and this is the second one. So in here we'll have our carrion golem and our summon holy relic, and this is linked to feeding frenzy. So cast when stunned to carrion golem, summon holy relic, and feeding frenzy. Now the reason we put feeding frenzy here is carrion golem is always up because cast when stunned works when you are stunned or whenever you block a stunning attack. Now we are not stunned that often because we use the Pantheon to handle stuns, but we're constantly blocking stunning attacks, so either way we are able to consistently keep up our golems. Now we need at least 2 more golems always up outside of our Herald of Purity because of how some of the nodes work in the Ascendancy tree for the Guardian, right? So we want to have at least 5 persons around at all times so we keep up onslaught and so that we do more damage. This is why this setup is necessary. And Carrion Golem continuously attacking, it sustains our feeding frenzy. It gives us about 10% more damage consistently. Back to the boots itself. These boots give us maximum mana. Again, we always want maximum mana. It gives us a bit of energy shield. It also gives 20% to all elemental resistances, which is crucial to the build. We always need that. And it gives us a bit of movement speed as well. Also, it gives us chance to block spell damage, which it's easier to scale attack damage and spell block damage. We're actually up to about 72, but using our flask we're able to consistently stay at 75. Now for gloves, we use Shaper's Touch. This particular variant is Legacy, so it gives a bit more energy shield and mana. However, it doesn't matter too much. You'd probably be down somewhere around 700 ES without using the Legacy versions. Either way, you need Shaper's Touch, as this will scale our energy shield and our mana. And we want to get, for defensive, if we're going defensively, we want to get Enfeeble on hit. This causes enemies that we hit and curse with Enfeeble to deal less damage to us. However, if you want to go a more offensive route, you can get a vulnerability on hit, which will give you a pretty good amount of increased damage, especially because it also gives them a chance to bleed. And if you use like Bloodlust in your setup along with like melee fizz and ruthless, you can get quite a bit more damage than my current setup. I personally was not able to find any vulnerability on hit gloves. Playing on consoles, the market is a bit less saturated than on PC, so everything's a bit more difficult to get, and I haven't been able to corrupt one myself yet. But Enfeeble is a great defensive option, and that's the route I've chosen to take. Now in our gloves is where we'd slot in our movement skill and utility skills. So In here you'd also put your molten shell. So I have molten shell linked to increased duration, and you can use shield charge if you want. I use flame dash instead because it clears obstacles. So flame dash linked to increased duration and molten shell. They don't necessarily have to be linked. The only thing that needs to be linked is your molten shell and increased duration. And just for the sake of it, I have a portal gem slotted in here as well. Now flasks, these are entirely up to you since we don't really rely on flasks to do much. The only thing you do need is a granite flask. I've gone with roomies because it gives that 14% chance to block attack damage and 9% chance to block spell damage. We don't need the attack damage, but it's nice to get that extra 3% chance to block spell damage. Now we need a granite flask because this gives us 3000 to armor, which is what helps us get over that 100k armor count. Right, typically armor has diminishing returns after a certain point, but armor never has diminishing returns for us because the more armor we have, the more energy shield we get when we block. So at 100k, whenever we block, we get back 2000 energy shield just on a single block. That's how significant it is. We pretty much always have up our molten shell, and we can either run a ton of these flasks to always have up 100k armor, or run more quicksilver flasks, which is what I did, and have at least one flask for something like freeze or to handle shock or anything of that nature. Now for the armor slot, we use Skin of the Loyal Simple Roll, as stated before, and this gives us +1 level of socketed gems and 100% increased global defenses. Now you can find the one that's corrupted that can also give you like +2 levels of socketed like duration gems, or an additional +1 level of socketed gems, and that would also be a huge boost to your DPS. Just going off the base Skin of the Loyal alone, here's where we would socket our main damage setup, which is Herald of Purity. Now ideally we want 4 red and 2 blue, however as you can see I was not even able to get that, so you should be able to get at least 3 red, 1 green, 2 blue relatively easily, which is what I did. And for that 1 green slot, the only thing that we can possibly fit in here that makes any sense is Impale. Yes, it does not give that much damage because the Impale is not consistent, but it gives more damage than something like faster attacks, which would be the other alternative. Now, the ideal setup is to have Herald of Purity linked to melee fizz or awaken melee fizz, awaken minion damage, empower, which is definitely needed, predator, which is needed, awakened minion damage as stated before, and we want, instead of Impale, the other red slot, we would use something like Ruthless, or I've heard some persons try out Multi-Strike, and if we were indeed using vulnerability, we'd use Bloodlust and Ruthless, right? But the setup that we have here is, you guys can see that for yourself, and Impale, while not being best in slot, still gives a respectable amount of damage. And this is where all our DPS comes from. Now onto the skill tree. At any point in time you can pause this video to take a better look at the skill tree, or you can just check the path of building in the link in the description and go over it there. The primary reason we're going over the skill tree here is to show you exactly where we socket these unique jewels, and to tell you the decisions that were made in terms of deciding what cluster jewels to use. Now we use a Clarity Watcher's Eye, and this is where you'd socket that jewel. It gives us gain 10% of maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield while affected by Clarity. So you only need a level 1 Clarity socketed so that you can get the benefits of this jewel. In addition to that, it gives you 6% increased maximum mana and 6% maximum energy shield. Now this isn't a must to make the build work. It's just something you would invest in at a later date to get that extra bit of juice out of the build. Now coming over to the left is where we'll slot our first of 2 cluster jewels, and we want a medium cluster jewel with something like 5 sockets. What we want on this cluster jewel is Cult Leader and Disciples. Cult Leader gives your minions 30% increased damage while you are affected by a Herald, and Disciples gives minions 20% increased damage while you're affected by a Herald, and Sentinels also have 20% increased cooldown recovery rate, or anything else that somehow affects your minions. That's what we're looking for on our medium cluster jewel. Now this will give us access to another cluster jewel slot, a small cluster jewel, and here we want a Stalwart Commander, right? Get something that has 2 passives. Why you want Stalwart Commander is because Grace, Determination, and Discipline all have 30% increased aura effect. Now we're only focused on the Determination and Discipline because that gives us more armor and more energy shield, so this is definitely a must on your small cluster jewel. And that's it for cluster jewels. We don't really mess around too much with them because we have more important uniques that take up our jewel slots. The first of these 3 important uniques is the Blue Nightmare Cobalt Jewel, and this is exactly where you want to slot it. We're not concerned with the gain 5% of lightning damage as extra chaos damage because we aren't doing lightning or chaos damage, but we're concerned with passives granting lightning resistance or all elemental resistance in this radius, giving us the chance to block spell damage at 35% of its value. Now without this, if we are to remove this gem, or spell damage, our spell block chance goes down to something like 44%, so we need it to get up to the flat 72 that we have without the use of a flask, so it is completely mandatory. We then travel to the middle, and this is where we'd put Fortress Covenant Cobalt Jewel. Not too much to explain. Minions just deal a bunch more damage and have chance to block attack and spell damage. Minions do take 20% increased damage based on like notable passives in this radius, but none of that really matters because the minions are basically immortal. We either keep spawning them back or keep replenishing their health, so minions taking damage isn't really a big deal. Our final unique jewel is Healthy Mind Cobalt Jewel. It gives us 90% increased maximum mana and transform increases and reductions in life radius to apply to mana at 200% of their value. Now I can't stress enough how important it is to have a ton of mana for this build, but just know that this jewel is definitely mandatory and it's not that expensive or too difficult to acquire. Now onto the final piece of the puzzle, Ascendancies. So Ascendancies, I can't stress how important they are, and the first Ascendancy point you would be picking up is Radiant Crusade, which grants 20% to all elemental resistances and onslaught and more damage while you have at least 5 nearby allies. So that's why Carrion and Summon Holy Relic are so important. Next we'd go down and we'd get Unwavering Crusade, which again is more damage, and it gives Intimidate and Unnerve. Now next up we'd pick up Radiant Faith, which at the end is one of the most important parts of the build because it grants armor equal to 160% of your reserve life, which you don't care about, or grants maximum energy shield up to 10% of your reserved mana. And we are reserving a ton. We're pretty much reserving all our mana, which is 5,000 mana. And finally we would pick up Time of Need. Now before you start asking why not Bastion of Hope, we already get maximum block through the use of Glancing Blows. Now I do know Glancing Blows does cause you to still take 65% of damage, but there's absolutely no way to achieve max block even with Bastion of Hope, and Bastion of Hope is not consistent, right? So we don't take Bastion of Hope at all, and we instead go for Time of Need. Now the reduced effect of curses on you is pretty nice, and just the fact that curses are removed after every 5 seconds and ailments, it contributes to the overall tanky feeling of the build. Harmony of Purpose is not really necessary, and neither is Unwavering Faith, right? And the final piece of the puzzle that actually makes the build work and prevents you from being stunned from here until eternity is Soul of the Brine King, which states that you cannot be stunned if you've been stunned or blocked a stunning hit in the past 2 seconds, and where max blocks, you're always blocking within at least the past 2 seconds, and even if we get one big stun here or there, it doesn't really matter. This allows us to move. If you do not have Soul of the Brine King allocated, you won't be able to move in maps. Stun is based on life, and we have 1 life, so almost every hit stuns us, right? So you definitely need this to make the build work. And that brings us to the end of the build, basically. To get a more detailed look at the skill tree, as stated before, you can either pause the video at certain sections, or you can go directly in the link and check out the path of building below. If you have any previous Path of Exile knowledge, all you need is a path of building, so definitely check it out. All your answers will be all your questions will be answered there by just checking out the path of building. I'll be living in the comment section below, so I'll also be jumping in to answer any of your questions if you like this kind of content. And if you want to see me put out a few more build guides, then go ahead and like and subscribe, because it definitely will help out the channel a lot. It's a very small channel, but Path of Exile is actually something I'm passionate about, and I do like creating these build guides, and it do take me a significant amount of time. So thanks for watching, and keep tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time.